The company takes a few days leaving the Unkar hills, but they don't encounter many more Unkari. As they descend out of the hills, they cross the border into Cadia's eastern neighbor, the Kingdom of Kirkworth. Kirkworth is a sizable Middish kingdom, landlocked and consequently less wealthy and powerful than Cadia, but large, with thriving farmland and a substantial population, named for the Kirk, an enormous cathedral that dates back a few hundred years, to the days when the Castilian Empire still controlled the Midlands. The Kirk was constructed by some of the best architects and artists of the old empire, for a wealthy Castilian convert to the Tarathi faith, named by the Castilians the Sancta Forma. As the Castilian influence merged with the native people of the Midlands, most of the Middish began calling it simply the Kirk, the church, as it so perfectly represents the word. It is widely considered the grandest Tarathi cathedral west of the Midland Mountains. In the world, it is likely second only to the Amud Kahal at Nahash. The Kirk is so magnificent that when Kirkworth became an independent nation, the kingdom's capital was built around it. The royal bloodline of Kirkworth, like many Middish noble lines, traces back to the Castilian citizens that ruled before the empire's decline, specifically to the bloodline of the Castilian that commissioned the cathedral's construction. And their seat has always sat alongside the Kirk, in a keep that is orders of magnitude less impressive in scope and elegance. The first few days inside Kirkworth pass uneventfully. They follow one of the main roads, an old Castilian road that spans most of the kingdom east and west. The road passes near a keep, surrounded by what appears to be a thriving trade town. Steelshod's resident Kirkie, Sir Gerald Thornton the Unicorn, identifies this as Terrington, seat of Lord Brendan Terry. Dawn of the day after they come into sight of Terrington, they are approached by a cluster of riders, a dozen or so men, armed and armored, flying Terry colors. The lead rider identifies himself as Sir Nathaniel Terry, heir to Terrington. They spotted the Serpentes sigil from the keep, extending an offer of hospitality from his father, Lord Terry. Brother Torthian tries to deflect, stresses the urgency of their mission, but there are political considerations to keep in mind. The Serpentes already passed through Kirkworth once, and recently. They leaned on Kirkworth to keep their supply lines well stocked, spent a considerable amount of social, religious, and political capital to ensure that Kirkworth did not hinder their passage. The relationship between Tarathia and the Middish kingdoms is sometimes confusing to people. By people, I mostly mean Yoren's player, because the Middish kingdoms all pay tithes and homage to the church, to Tarathia, but they still consider themselves sovereign lands. They respect Tarathia's military might and position as a holy land of sorts, but the perks this gives do have limits. And now, traipsing through Kirkworth with 100 men and twice that number of horses, well, it could test the limits of hospitality that Kirkworth is comfortable with. So, they accept the offer of the Terrys, delay their journey by a day to enter Terrington and meet with Lord Terry. Lord Terry seems a decent enough sort, actually. Brother Torthian is forthright about why they've returned and how urgent their mission is. Still, Lord Terry says they must detour themselves further. They may only be 100 strong, but they are 100 heavily armed men, including Serpentes. That makes them, in effect, a foreign army, and Brother Torthian admits that the rest of the Serpentes, all 10,000 of them, are likely to follow him as soon as possible. Terry knows that King James Tiberius will want to speak with them, to ensure that Kirkworth's independence is respected, and would be wroth if he learned Terry had let them simply pass unchecked. Shitty news, but they really can't ignore this request. If they sufficiently piss off Kirkworth, they could easily find themselves detained much, much longer. So, they go several days out of their way, allowing Sir Nathaniel to escort them all the way to the Kirk. Kirkworth is scarred by the same intermittent craters that Cadia is. The firefall, it seemed, hit here as well. But aside from that, the land is almost idyllic. They experienced their share of raids from Sephardic marauders, a few churches burned, a few farms looted, but no serious fighting. The land is not war-torn and drenched with blood in the same way Cadia has become. Most farms and keeps they pass seem to go about their daily lives, preparing for winter in these last days of autumn. And eventually, they find themselves closing in on the kingdom's capital. The Kirk really is everything it's cracked up to be. An enormous sweeping structure, with impressive arches, pillars, frescoes, statues, murals, stained glass, the whole works. Even the non-Tarathi of the company can't deny it's quite impressive. But His Majesty King James Tiberius IV is, sadly, less impressive. He greets them warmly enough, hosts all 100 men in his great hall, but it's clear from the way he speaks to Brother Torthian that he is not happy. As Terry feared, King James sees this as the Serpentes overstepping their authority, expecting to move their Ares through his lands a second time. At one point, Torthian perhaps loses his cool a little. "Your Majesty," he says, "if, indeed, Brother Kashar wishes to move his 10,000 Serpentes back to Kirkworth, do you believe that you would be in a position to stop him?" True or not, and it's totally true, the implied threat pisses off the king considerably. Alexander steps in, smoothing over the ruffled king's feathers, offering to find some way of compensating Kirkworth for the imposition they have caused. King James considers this. After all, he's heard of Steelshod by now. Not so very long ago, Yoren and Alexander hit Tier 10, and gained, as a bonus, "We're kind of a big deal." So, they're up to Reputation +2 now, and I'm starting to get an idea of what that means as a GM. King James tells them that he has been having a great deal of trouble on his southern border. The kingdom of Cardenbury has become something of a thorn in his side, taking advantage of all the turmoil of this last year and trying to grab some contested borderlands. In truth, reading between the lines of what the king does not say, Steelshod grows convinced that Kirkworth is just looking to settle some long-lasting border disputes. Based on King James' general attitude, Alexander and Yoren suspect Kirkworth may even be the aggressor, but they can't afford to pick a fight on that front. King James wants them to provide him a service. Help him settle the dispute with Cardenbury. If Steelshod stays to serve Kirkworth, he will allow the Serpentes to continue. Yoren and Alexander tell him they will consider his proposal and enjoy the hospitality of the king for perhaps a few more nights. They're not going to consider his proposal. Instead, Yoren is devising something of a terrible plan. He confers with Hubert. See, Hubert and Yoren have been cooking up a new alchemy recipe during their off-hours. Still highly unstable, but the mix seems to have certain volatile, violent properties. Yoren and Hubert work together on the recipe, testing extensively, nearly killing themselves in a mishap that destroys several valuable alchemical tools, but it provides the eureka moment they've been seeking. They successfully develop the recipe for Thunderbolt. Thunder in a bottle, more accurately. A powerful explosive. While Hubert and Yoren try to find a way out of their conundrum, the rest of Steelshod is just killing time, checking out the Kirk, the local taverns, training, practicing, socializing, picking fights. At one point, several members of Steelshod are returning to the King's Keep after an evening on the town, and one of the Kirky guards, an unlanded knight on glorified gate duty, decides to give them some shit. He sees Hrodir and Drengi, accosts them for being Sephardic barbarians, the same barbarians that have killed innocent Middish. Hrodir and Drengi hate backing down from fights, but they are obedient and loyal, and Alexander has told them they must not react to bait of this nature, not if they wish to stay in Steelshod and adapt to Middish society. So, they simply ignore him. The knights having none of that. He keeps needling them, and his fellow knights start joining in as well. So Kara steps in and insults him back. Kara calls him a coward and a fool. She tries to rile him. But when the knight hears the Unkari accent, he perks up even more. More barbarians. Steelshod is fucking infested with barbarian scum, it seems. He turns his attention to her, calling out her people for being even worse than the Sfards. Now, Felix is a simple man, with simple needs and simple pleasures. When a knight insults the Sephardic Ulfskenar that he knows in passing and just barely tolerates, well, it may be conduct unbecoming a knight, but he isn't much concerned. But when that knight insults his lady love, that's a very different story. Felix smacks the knight across the face, challenging him to a duel of honor. The knight seems taken aback, starts to scoff that some backwoods mercenary from Highhurst, easy mistake due to Felix's brogue, thinks he can challenge a knight. That's where you're wrong, laddie, Felix is only too happy to retort. Sir Felix Wren, sworn knight of Lord Preston Chatsworth at your service. Are you going to accept? Or prove to your friends what we both already know, that you're a coward like the lassie said? The knight introduces himself as Sir Evan Lafferty, and he accepts. Time and place, now in the courtyard. His weapon of choice is the sword. Kara isn't amused or flattered. Felix is a dab hand with a longbow, but he's not nearly as good with a blade. She quietly calls him an idiot, tells him to be careful, and kisses him for luck. Felix scoffs, but he kisses her back. The duel is one of offended honor, satisfied by the first to bleed or yield. Felix draws his sword and follows Sir Evan to the courtyard. Evan is a tall, hard-looking man. He sheds his tabard and extra ornamentation, down to iron mail and breastplate, and a very long sword. Felix sizes him up as he approaches. Evan has the bearing of a hedge knight, a man who's served many lords and seen many battles. The cushy gate job is probably a position he earned through hard fighting and loyal service, and he looks pissed. Picking a fight with Sfards and Unkar could very well be he's lost friends or family to barbarian raiders, that he's taking this personally. He turns to Felix, enters a comfortable guard stance, beckons Felix closer, and Felix realizes that perhaps he'll need that luck Kara gave him after all. Thank you for tuning in to Steelshod, a series by Mostly Rights, narrated by Taleforge. You can find every chapter in text format, as well as character sheets, setting information, maps, and rule documents on the Steelshod tabletop system in the link below. If you'd like to support the channel, you can pop down to the description and use the Patreon link for recurring donations, the paypal.me link for one-time donations, the Teespring link for shirts with the incredibly cool background art by Nobody, or use the DriveThruRPG affiliate link the next time you're looking to try a new system. If you'd like to support the author, you can find Steelshod merch on the MostlyRights.com store, or donate to the Mostly Rights Patreon, which are both linked on reddit.com/r/mostlyrights down below.